Imagine inheriting America's most expensive private palace, 110 rooms of marble and gold, only to learn the Widener heirs died on the Titanic. The West Wing was locked, and the house began to rot in silence. Locals still point at its dark windows and say it's waiting. I'm John. Now here's how Lynnewood Hall was built to defeat time, and why time won anyway. Before Lynnewood was a ruin, it was a weapon. Peter A.B. Widener was one of those Gilded Age men who didn't just make money. He built systems that made money move. Philadelphia transit, finance, boardrooms, political pull. The kind of fortune that doesn't buy a nice home. It buys a statement so large, nobody can ignore it. So when Widener chose Elkins Park, just outside Philadelphia, he didn't ask for comfortable. He ordered a palace, a house that could host power, store art, and broadcast one message: this family isn't temporary. Lynnewood Hall went up at the turn of the century, designed to look older than it was. Massive symmetry, classical lines. A building that feels like it's already a landmark the day it opens. Inside, it wasn't laid out like a normal home, where a family drifts between rooms. It was laid out like an institution. Formal spaces for display, long corridors for separation, service routes designed so staff could move without being seen. And that's the first detail that matters if you want to understand why the house later feels haunted, even without ghosts. A palace doesn't just hold people, it organizes them. There are rooms built for being watched, grand salons, dining spaces, halls that turn a guest into an audience. There are rooms built for controlling access, doors that cut off wings, staircases that funnel movement, corridors that let the house go quiet in one section while a party rages in another. Lynnewood wasn't designed to feel lived in, it was designed to feel owned. Widener filled it the way a collector fills a vault. He was obsessed with art and legacy, the idea that taste could be inherited like stock. If a normal rich man buys a painting, a Widener buys a collection that becomes part of his name. The house wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a container for permanence. But here's the quiet problem built into the blueprint. A palace only works if the future keeps arriving. A house like this needs heirs, the way a factory needs power. Without them, the building doesn't downsize, it hollows out. The staff still clean rooms nobody uses. The footsteps still echo in spaces that were meant to be filled. The money still bleeds out just to keep dust from winning. And the Widener future? Everything Lynnewood was built to protect had names: George, Harry, the line that was supposed to carry the estate forward. That's why the Titanic isn't just a dramatic side note in this story. It's the moment Lynnewood stops being a palace and becomes a sealed container. Because in April 1912, George D. Widener and his son, Harry Elkins Widener, sail on Titanic, and neither one comes home. The telegram reached Elkins Park before the official confirmations did. That's how wealth works in a crisis. Information travels fast, but it arrives in fragments, and every fragment makes you imagine the rest. First it's Titanic struck ice, then it's women and children, then it's names missing. By the time the truth settles, it doesn't settle gently. George is gone, Harry is gone. The heir and the heir to the heir, wiped out in a single night in the Atlantic. The mansion that was built to prove the family would last suddenly has a future shaped like an empty hallway. This is where the Widener story turns darker than the headline, because death at sea doesn't just remove people. It changes the behavior of everyone left behind. In houses like Lynnewood, grief doesn't look like crying on a sofa. It looks like routine being rewritten. It looks like wings being closed. It looks like doors that stop opening. There are multiple accounts and local traditions about what happened next, but they all circle the same core. The house quieted down. Staff were reduced. Entertaining slowed to almost nothing. And one section of the building, always described as a wing, a corridor, a set of rooms, was treated differently, locked, preserved, or simply avoided. Here's what makes that believable, even if you ignore every ghost rumor. Palaces don't mourn the way apartments do. In a small home, you can stay near the memory and still function. In a palace, memory becomes geography. You can walk into the wrong salon and feel like you just stepped into a life that isn't coming back. So people stop going there. Then fewer footsteps means more creaks. More echoes, more imagination. The building starts doing what empty buildings always do. It amplifies itself. And Lynnewood was big enough to become its own echo chamber. Caretakers described how sound traveled weirdly. A door shut on one floor could be heard on another. A draft would push through a corridor like the house was breathing. On windy nights, the place could sound like someone moving furniture upstairs. Because in a mansion with long flues, old chimneys, and dozens of closed rooms, air doesn't move gently. It whistles, it knocks, it finds gaps. That's the rational foundation for the myths. And Lynnewood has had plenty of myths. The most common one starts with a simple, creepy image that locals repeat like a dare. A chandelier flickering in a room nobody is supposed to enter. Not a blaze of light, just a faint, pulsing glow, like someone testing a switch in the dark. People tie it to the Titanic wing, because every legend needs an anchor. Another story is even simpler. Footsteps above you when the upper floor is closed. Not running, not loud, just a measured pace that stops when you stop, like it knows you're listening. If you've ever been in a huge empty structure, you know how that can happen. Pipes tick, wood contracts, animals get in. But Lynnewood's size gives every normal noise a human shape. And once a place gains that reputation, every caretaker becomes part of the story without meaning to. One longtime local rumor says a clock inside the mansion stopped at the hour news arrived of the Titanic loss and was never reset. That's almost certainly a myth, because myths love symbolism. But it tells you what people wanted the building to be. Not just abandoned, but marked, because abandoned is ordinary. Marked is a legend. And here's where the mansion's darkness becomes real again. Not supernatural, economic. After Titanic, Lynnewood becomes too much house for a shrinking future. The cost to maintain it doesn't drop just because the dining room is empty. The roof still leaks. The plaster still cracks. The gardens still overgrow. And when a palace starts losing the small daily battles, it begins a kind of slow collapse that looks like a curse from the outside. The family name still carries power, but the building starts to feel like a burden. Nobody wants to admit is a burden. That's when the second phase begins. The decades where Lynnewood Hall isn't just quiet. It becomes famous for being quiet. And once a place becomes famous for emptiness, the wrong people start showing up. Curious strangers, urban explorers, thieves, locals testing fences, all feeding the idea that something is trapped inside. And the longer the house sits, the more the same question comes up again and again. If this palace was built for forever, why does it feel like it's waiting for someone who never came back? After the Titanic, the Widener fortune didn't disappear. That's the part people misunderstand when they call Lynnewood cursed. The money was still there. The power was still there. What changed was the point of the house. For years, Lynnewood had been the physical proof of a plan. One family, one palace, one future. When George and Harry didn't come home, that plan snapped. The family didn't need to announce it. You could see it in what stopped happening. Fewer guests, fewer carriages, fewer lights burning deep into the night. And then grief found a new place to live. Eleanor Widener survived the Titanic. She returned without her husband and without her son. And instead of pouring that pain into Lynnewood, she poured it into something the world could see and never ignore. A memorial that turned the family's tragedy into public legacy. That's how you get a strange shift, where the future of the Widener name stops being a home and starts being an institution. Lynnewood, meanwhile, stayed behind like a shell that was too big to carry. Over the next decades, the house drifts into a half-life that's more unsettling than a clean abandonment. Not fully lived, not fully closed, maintained just enough to keep it standing, but not enough to keep it warm. That in-between stage is where the scariest stories are born, because the building is still being touched by human hands, but not loved. Caretakers come and go. Contractors come for small repairs and leave fast. A roof leak gets patched and then opens somewhere else. A plaster crack gets filled and reappears like the house refuses to stay fixed. Empty rooms take on smells, old fabric, damp wood, stale smoke, because air doesn't move right when a palace is shut down wing by wing. And as the place becomes less home and more property, the rumors sharpen. One of the most repeated ones isn't about ghosts. It's about rules. People in the area talk about a section of the mansion that was treated like a forbidden zone. Not nobody ever went there, but nobody went there alone. Not because they'd see a spirit, but because it felt wrong. Too quiet, too cold, too untouched. Doors that hadn't been opened in years have a different weight when you push them. The hinges don't sound like a normal house. They sound like a vault. Then come the little incidents that don't prove anything, but they keep happening in the same ways. A caretaker locks up at dusk, walks the perimeter, returns to the service hall, and finds one interior door unlatched that he swears he latched. He checks the windows. All shut. No footprints. No signs of entry. Just that one door, open a few inches, like a breath. A contractor working on wiring reports that a chandelier in a closed salon flickered as if someone had bumped the switch. But the circuit was dead and the switch plate had been removed. Old houses do strange things. But not like that. Not on cue. The most unnerving rumor ties directly to the Titanic, because locals can't resist a clean connection. They say some nights you can smell salt water in one corridor, just a faint briny dampness that doesn't belong in inland Pennsylvania. That one is easy to dismiss. Smell is memory. Old stone holds moisture. People project. But the fact the rumor sticks tells you how the mansion is perceived, as if the ocean followed the family home. Then the practical darkness moves in. As the decades roll, the mansion becomes harder to justify financially and harder to protect physically. Once a place is known to be quiet and underused, it attracts the worst kind of attention. People who don't come for history, they come for materials. Copper, fixtures, anything they can strip and sell. A broken window becomes a trend. A door forced once becomes an invitation. And every intrusion changes the building in a way that makes the next rumor feel more believable. Someone hears a crash at night and says it was a ghost. It was probably thieves. Someone sees a light and swears the place is alive. It might be a flashlight moving through a hall. That's how Lynnewood becomes two things at once: a real, decaying structure and a legend that grows faster than the decay. And here's the turning point that makes it feel truly doomed. Attempts to sell it start failing. Not because nobody wants a mansion. Because Lynnewood isn't just a mansion. It's a private palace with a public reputation. It's too large for normal buyers, too expensive to restore for casual investors, and too famous to quietly remodel without people noticing. Every time someone considers it, they also inherit the myth, the maintenance nightmare, and the eyes on the gates. So the building sits, and sitting is what kills a palace. A lived-in house can survive decades. An empty palace starts to rot from the inside out. Small problems become structural problems. Water becomes mold. Mold becomes damaged wood. Damage becomes, this will cost more than the purchase. And once that math becomes obvious, the mansion stops being a dream and becomes a warning. That's why Lynnewood's emptiness feels so heavy. It isn't just abandoned. It's a monument that outlived the purpose it was built for. And the longer it stands like that, the more the final question becomes unavoidable. Was this house ever meant to be lived in? Or was it always meant to be a tomb for a family name? The first time someone seriously tried to save Lynnewood, they didn't arrive with candles and ghost hunting gear. They arrived with a clipboard. A broker walked the halls, counting problems the way you count money. Roof sections, broken windows, water damage, heating that hadn't run right in years. In a normal house, you list repairs. In a palace, you list systems. And every system has a price tag big enough to scare off sane buyers. That's why so many sale attempts die the same way. The photos look like a dream. The numbers read like a punishment. And then the building adds its final weapon, its reputation. Because Lynnewood isn't just a property. It's a story people already know. Titanic airs, sealed rooms, decades of silence. The moment a new buyer steps in, neighbors start watching. Reporters call. Urban explorers circle the fence. The mansion becomes a stage again. Only now it's a stage for decay. And in that long era of half-abandonment, the myths sharpen into specific rituals. Locals talk about a wing that stays shut no matter who owns the place. They call it the Titanic rooms, even if nobody can prove the rooms were ever formally dedicated to that grief. But the label sticks because it makes emotional sense. When you lose the future, you lock it away and pretend the door is preservation. Caretakers keep logs, most of them boring, until one entry ruins the page for everyone who reads it. A night watchman writes that he did his rounds, checked every latch, and found the same door on the same corridor ajar twice in 1 week. No sign of forced entry, no broken glass, no footprints. Just the door moved a few inches, like the house was testing whether anyone still cared. Another caretaker swears he heard a phone ring once in a room that had no active line. He follows the sound, opens the door, and the ringing stops the moment he steps into the threshold. You can explain it a dozen ways. Old wiring, a sound carrying through vents, a neighbor's line echoing. Except the caretaker reports one detail that makes people uncomfortable. The sound came from behind a wall where the phone jack had been removed. Then there's the story that spreads because it's so simple you can picture it. A chandelier in a formal room flickers late at night. Not a full light up, just a faint pulse, like a dying heartbeat. The next morning, the room is dark and silent again. Electricians later blame old circuits and moisture. Locals shrug and say, "That's the house." Here's what makes Lynnewood feel genuinely frightening, even if you don't believe in anything supernatural. The building's emptiness isn't quiet. It's active. Wind moves through huge cavities. Pipes tick. Stone cools and cracks. Animals get inside and vanish into walls that are thick enough to hide an entire life. In a normal home, those noises are small. In a palace, they sound like someone walking. And that's why the mansion starts collecting visitors who should never be there. Trespassers don't come because they love architecture. They come because an empty palace feels like a challenge. They slip through gaps, use flashlights, film the grand staircase, whisper to the camera about curses, then leave the building a little more damaged than before. A broken pane becomes a future entry point. A forced door becomes a habit. Meanwhile, the house keeps rotting in slow motion. Water is the real killer. It doesn't announce itself. It leaks into ceilings, softens beams, stains walls, breeds mold, and turns a restoration dream into a nightmare that multiplies every season you wait. A palace doesn't collapse all at once. It gives up inch by inch, until one day the price of fixing it stops being expensive and becomes impossible. That's when Lynnewood becomes the final symbol it never meant to be. Peter Widener built it to prove wealth could create permanence. Titanic proved permanence is a fantasy. And the mansion, this giant, arrogant statement, ends up doing the opposite of what it was designed to do. Instead of protecting a legacy, it broadcasts its failure. Because the richest man's palace doesn't sit proud and lived in. It sits empty. It sits watched. It sits decaying behind fences like a warning sign. And if you want one last chilling thought to land this whole story, the Widener airline didn't disappear in a courtroom or a scandal. It vanished in the dark, freezing ocean, far from the palace built to keep the family forever. The house didn't get a dramatic ending. It got something colder. A future that never arrived. Thanks for watching. Hit like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. I love seeing how far this community reaches. All of us pulled in by the same obsession with the real stories behind famous places. If you watched the video to the end, would you ever want to own a mansion like Lynnewood Hall?